In the last section of the lecture, I finished up by talking about the phase from the 1870s to around the 1920s when Latin America grew by historical standards and also by the standards of other countries at the time at a relatively rapid rate. It did that by utilising its comparative advantage in being a producer of raw materials that it could supply to the Western world, which was growing rapidly in the aftermath of the Industrial Revolution. What I want to do in this section of the lecture is move on to talk about the next major phase of Latin American, the history of Latin American economic development. A phase from about 1930 to the 1970s, early 1980s, a phase that's associated with a particular policy approach, a policy approach that is referred to as ISI. What ISI means is import substituting industrialisation. This was the idea that you would try to promote growth by substituting imports of consumer goods with home production. In other words, you're trying to generate home production of consumer goods to replace what otherwise would have been imports of those goods. So it's a particular approach to industrialisation or promoting industrialisation. It's promoting industrialisation by trying to produce consumer goods that are going to substitute for imports. And so this policy approach fits within the broad rubric of government approaches to industrialisation that we've talked about in the course, but it's also a little bit different. So if you think about China and the Soviet Union with big push industrialisation, there's this philosophy of trying to industrialise, but the idea is that you industrialise in the first instance by creating heavy industry, iron and steel industries, for example. Or we also saw with the high-performing Asian economies the idea that there would be an emphasis on industrialisation as a source of economic growth and economic development. A difference from this idea of ISI was that you would industrialise not just with the objective of substituting imports, but also with the objective potentially of developing major export markets. So ISI is a particular approach to industrialisation. So it fits within the general idea of governments trying to promote economic growth or economic development via industrialisation, but it also has some special characteristics, which is this focus on industrialising via consumer goods that are going to replace inputs. And what I'm going to do in the rest of this section of the lecture is really talk about the history of the implementation and consequences of ISI during this period. Before I do that though, I wanted to talk about someone called Raul Prebisch. So at various points in the course I've tried to talk about some of the main economic thinkers who might have influenced policy making that was occurring in particular regions at the time. And so I wanted to introduce in that way Raul Prebisch here. Prebisch was an influential Argentine economist, lived from 1901 to 1986. He was head of CIPAL, the UN Economic Commission for Latin America, and also head of UNCTAD. So he held major policy making roles. He authored a large number of works during his life. Perhaps one of the most prominent was, especially with regard to the implementation of ISI policies, was the book The Economic Development of Latin America and Its Principal Problems from 1950. Prebisch was one of the main architects of the policy of ISI. As we'll see in the rest of this section of the lecture, as we look back from the present to ISI, we'll see that ISI was a policy approach that's nowadays regarded as having brought some short-term benefits, but in the long run and in overall terms probably disadvantaged Latin America in a variety of ways. Nevertheless, I think it's important to think of Prebisch as a major and impressive thinker. First of all, it's always important to remember that in making the judgment about ISI, we're looking backward with 60 years of historical experience and more developments in economic theory and empirical economics to inform our judgment. I think Prebisch is impressive, first of all, as a figure who was absolutely committed to economic development, to the task of economic development, to try to economic development as a way to improve human well-being, especially in Latin America. He's also someone impressive, I think, as someone who really tried to think about Latin America in an integral way, who tried to come up with his own approaches for thinking about development in Latin America that reflected the circumstances of Latin America. Prebisch was also impressive, I think, as someone who you could only regard as a doer. I've got a quote here from Edgar Dosman's biography, The Life and Times of Raoul Prebisch, where he describes Prebisch as a driving force in development thought and diplomacy who changed the vocabulary of international politics. Prebisch's idealism carried him into the top international group of people who make history rather than endure it. And I've read Dosman's biography of Prebisch, and the thing that really struck me about the biography was in fact this last line of the quote. To what extent Prebisch does come across as someone who really tried to make history, who engaged with what he saw as the main problems of economic development, rather than responding to issues or problems that were brought to him. So he's a great example, I think, of someone who really thought for himself from the ground up about major economic issues and thought in an integral way about how to deal with those issues. And so he lies behind a lot, as we'll see, a lot of the thinking that was associated with the implementation of ISI policies during this period. The policy of ISI really initially came about not as a well thought out response to development issues in Latin America, but initially as a response to the circumstances of the Great Depression. The Great Depression really caused a reorientation of economic policy in Latin America. So you had very significant deterioration in the terms of trade in Latin America. You had a stop to capital flows. So European capital markets, which had been lending to Latin America, that dries up in the Great Depression. You've got the real value of debt that Latin America owes to the rest of the world rising because of price deflation. And you've got other countries in the world moving to try and respond themselves to the Great Depression by implementing various trade barriers or trying to increase production to offset the declines in prices for commodities that are occurring at the time. So to give two examples, one is that Argentina is significantly disadvantaged in selling beef products, refrigerated beef for example, to Britain by the agreement that Britain signs with, the imperial preference agreement that Britain signs with its dominions such as Australia and Canada during the Great Depression. That really significantly cuts Argentina out of what had been its main market for beef. Brazil, which had dominated the world coffee market in the 1920s, in the 1920s and 1930s, other producers responding to what they perceive to be relatively high prices for coffee start to increase production, and that really disadvantages Brazil as a coffee producer, and Brazil ends up destroying large amounts of coffee that's been produced in Brazil as a way of trying to keep the price of coffee up during this period. So the Great Depression brings a variety of forces into play which really disadvantage the Latin American region significantly through the effect on its capacity to trade, to earn export income from other other developed or from developed parts of the world, and also the ability to take capital from those parts of the world to sustain investment activity. Here's one perspective on the disadvantage to Latin America from the Great Depression. So it tells you the change in the volume of exports compared to 1925-29 in 1930-34 and 1930-39. So you can see the volume of exports declines by 8.8% and then 2.4% compared to 1925-29. The terms of trade, so the price Argentina is getting for its exports compared to what it's paying for its imports, deteriorates in both periods, or it's lower in both periods compared to 1925-29, quite substantially in 1930-34. And so the capacity of Latin America to import is substantially reduced during this period. So because of the reduction in the capacity of Latin America to sell its exports to the rest of the world in 1930-34, it could afford 30% less imports than it had been affording in the period 25 to 29, and over 10% in the period as a whole from 1930 to 39. So Latin America has to really respond to this reduced capacity to export, and as a result of that, reduced capacity to import. And not all countries react in terms of changes in policy, but the larger countries tend to be reactive and adopt policies which consist of currency devaluation, consist of implementing trade protection measures, and in some cases there are debt defaults as well. So basically policies that are oriented to, partly towards trying to promote the sale of exports through currency devaluation, which reduces the cost of Latin American exports in the rest of the world, increases the price of imports, and also trade protection measures to try and raise the costs of imports to Latin America. So, in other words, trying to remedy the external imbalance created through the Great Depression that I showed in the last table by policies that seek to increase exports and reduce imports. And the relatively strong rebound that happens in Latin America from the Great Depression provides an underpinning to the longer term adoption of ISIs. So this turning inward that happens in Latin America following the Great Depression is seen as an economic success, and that provides one rationale for adopting inward-looking policies in a more thoroughgoing manner. Here's a graph that shows the bounce back after the Great Depression. So the blue line is Western Europe, the red line are the Western offshoots, the US, Canada, New Zealand and Australia, and here's Latin America. And you can see that essentially Latin America, for example, bounces back more quickly than the Western offshoots, more quickly than the US, Australia, Canada, and quite close to Europe. So this really gives rise to, or following that phase of emergency ISI, there's another phase of ISI that we describe as more deliberate ISI, that rather responding to a particular policy crisis like the Great Depression, now ISI is going to be adopted because it's seen as a sensible policy for the future economic development of Latin America. And as I've mentioned, a lot of the economic rationale for ISI comes from Raul Prebisch and the UN Economic Commission in Latin America. And they provide a variety of economic rationales for why it's sensible for Latin America to shift towards a policy approach which involves, as I described right at the start of this section of the lecture, trying to industrialize via producing consumer goods that are going to substitute for imports. One of the reasons is that the idea that if Latin America continues to try to specialize in production of raw materials and agricultural products, then it is essentially going to be condemned to a low development future. And that's because what's called the Prebisch-Singer hypothesis, which was Prebisch and Singer looked at data on the prices of raw materials and agricultural products in the period up to the 1940s and argued that they observed a long-run downward trend in the price of those commodities. They argued that there were structural factors that explained why historically the price decline had been occurring and why it would continue to occur, primarily to do with the nature of markets out of which raw materials and agricultural products were supplied, and also to do with changing patterns of demand for those commodities. So they made the argument at the moment Latin American economies are concentrated, are specialised in production of raw materials and agricultural products, but there is a long-term trend going on which is causing the prices of those products to decline. So continued specialisation in production of those products is going to be associated with earning smaller and smaller amounts, for example, of export income, and that's going to have an adverse effect on economic development in Latin America. Associated with that first point about declining prices for the types of products which Latin America had been engaged in exporting was the idea that there was going to develop what Prebisch called a foreign trade gap. There was going to be an imbalance between exports and imports that would keep growing because of the structural factors that were causing the decline in the price of raw materials and agricultural products, and also because he argued that much of the imports that a country like Argentina was bringing in were supplied by large oligopolistic manufacturing concerns who had price-setting power. So he predicted a situation where there would be an ongoing foreign trade gap, a gap between exports and imports for countries in Latin America. And to remedy that gap, you would have to reduce the income elasticity of imports via ISI. In other words, there are these structural factors which are causing export income to decline. So if you want to close the gap between imports and exports, you have to bring down imports. The way to do that is by home producing a lot more of the imports than is happening up until now. So you've got exports and imports. Exports are going to keep decreasing or certainly not increase. So if you're going to close the gap, you've got to bring imports down. And the way to do that is by ISI, which means that some of these imports start to be produced within the Latin American economies rather than having to be imported from the rest of the world. Prebisch also argued that if you were going to develop industry, for example, to produce these consumer goods, you really had to give government support to it in order to achieve large enough scale of production to be producing at a cost of production which could compete with imports. And he argued that ISI, the approach of industrialising the Latin American economies, would bring spillover of benefits, that essentially industrialisation was associated with stronger linkages to other areas of economic activity than, for example, agricultural activity was. And so by forcing the pace of industrialisation in Latin America, you would bring to bear more of these positive spillover effects on economic activity. There was also, to some degree, a political rationale for ISI. The period when ISI is being implemented as a policy is really the period when the balance of political power in a lot of Latin American countries is changing. Away from a situation where the predominant group are rural workers, towards a situation where the predominant group are an urban working class population. So the idea of industrialising, the idea of providing jobs for an urban working class population was in many Latin American countries politically attractive. Now, as I mentioned before, when we sit here today and look back at policies like ISI, we can think of many critiques of those policies. It's important to point out that the proponents of ISI at the time weren't unaware of possible criticisms of these policies. And so, for example, one version of ISI is what's known as the Hirschman model. And the Hirschman model was really designed to address potential shortcomings of the ISI model. So the Hirschman model said, look, one problem with giving protection to industry is that we know that it can get used to that protection. And it just becomes an excuse for inefficient production rather than being a way to really generate a successful industry. And so the Hirschman model involved, first of all, the idea that if you were going to provide protection to local industry in Latin America, that it had to be temporary and reduced over time. There had to be time limits so that producers, and it had to be reduced over time so that local producers in Latin America knew that at some point they were going to be exposed to a level playing field in terms of competition with international producers. Hirschman also argued that only selected industries should be promoted, that the government should really, or policymakers should really think about what were the industries that were going to address the issues that ISI was intended to address, such as promoting economic development through industrialisation, through the linkages that would come to the rest of the economy, or to promoting other new areas of economic activity through industrialisation, or the areas in which you were particularly intending to replace production of consumer goods. That this shouldn't be a policy to subsidise all areas of industry, that it should be targeted. So it's certainly not the case when we come to critique this model of policy making that policymakers at the time were unaware of some of the problems. But as the famous Argentine development economist Carlos Diaz Alejandro says, the problem is that while there were some at the time who understood the potential shortcomings of this model, many didn't, and this model of ISI was likely to become dangerous in the sloppy hands of mediocre followers. So what actually happened? Well, ISI type policies were adopted mainly by larger countries, initially, as I've explained, as an emergency type measure in the period after the Great Depression, but then increasingly as a deliberate measure in the period from the late 1940s and especially in the 1950s onwards. The type of ISI policies that were introduced really provided support to direct economic activity to home production. So there's this objective that we want to promote home production of consumer goods. So there was a variety of policies directed explicitly at that objective. The general theme of those policies was to try and change relative prices in a way that increased the relative profitability of producing industrial consumer goods for the home market. One of the major ways in which relative prices was changed was by the introduction of tariffs and quotas. So tariffs increasing the price of imports, making it more profitable for local producers to produce the goods on which the tariffs had been imposed, or imposing quotas on imports, creating a larger space in the local market for local producers in Latin America to be producing the goods on which the quota had been imposed. The other aspect of ISI was the creation of state-owned enterprises in strategic sectors. So many governments engaging in ISI came to believe that there was going to be problems for the private sector in their countries in obtaining finance to finance investment that was necessary for industrialisation, and if they could obtain finance, that it was be something that could only be done internationally, and this is really a period where the Latin American economies are closing down to the rest of the world. The reaction to the Great Depression had really been, as I've mentioned, a turning inward, a desire to become independent of the rest of the world economy. And so there was an unwillingness on the part of governments to allow private sector investment to be provided through foreign investment. And so instead, these economies that are engaging in this ISI set up a range of state-owned enterprises. For example, Corfo in Chile or the Banco Industrial in Argentina. One way in which you can see the effect of this ISI policy is through the reducing engagement of Latin America with world trade. This is a graph that shows the percentage of this is a table that shows the percentage of world trade accounted for by Latin America. And you can see in 1946, Latin America accounted for 13.5% of world trade, almost double its proportion of the world's population. So Latin America, on per capita terms in 1946, is relatively engaged with the world economy. But as ISI is increasingly used as a policy approach, we see that the Latin American share of world trade decreases threefold down to a situation where in 1975 it's only accounting for about 4.5% of world trade. And you can see that for individual examples like Argentina and Brazil, they fit that pattern as well. Argentina, from being very extensively involved in world trade, 3.5% of world trade, by 1975 less than 0.5% of world trade.